This video will be divided into the following parts to introduce. First, let's learn about the user permission model in the MRS cluster. The MRS cluster user permission model consists of users, user groups, roles, and permissions. Permissions are defined by the component side and are allowed to access a resource of the component. Different components have different permissions for their own resources. For example, the HDFS component has the read, write, and execute permissions on file resources in the file system. For the HBase component, users have the create, read, and write permissions on data table resources. A role is a set of component permissions. A role can have multiple permissions for multiple components, and different roles can have the permissions for the same resource of the same component. A user group is a collection of users. When a user group is associated with one or more roles, the users in the user group have the component permissions defined by the roles. Different user groups can be associated with the same role, and a user group can be associated with no role. For some components, the system assigns certain permissions to specific default user groups by default. A user is a visitor to the system. The rights of a user are the rights corresponding to the user group and role associated with the user. To obtain the rights, a user needs to be added to a user group or associated with a role. In an MRS cluster, user permission configuration is classified into role-based permission control and policy-based permission control. The MRS cluster uses role-based permission control to manage the permissions of the big data system. The permission of each component in the system is displayed and managed in a centralized manner. The permission management details of common users are shielded, and the permission management operations are simplified for administrators. The usability and user experience of permission management are improved. MRS clusters also support policy-based permission control for the Ranger component. It can implement fine-grained data access control for components such as HDFS, Hive, and HBase. Note that components in a cluster support only one permission control mechanism at a time. After the Ranger permission control policy is enabled for a component, the permission of the role created on Manager becomes invalid. You need to add a policy on the Ranger management page to grant resource permission. Some roles are preconfigured in the MRS system by default for routine use. You can log into Fusion Insight Manager and view the role list. For example, Manager Administrator indicates the Manager Administrator. Users associated with this role have access to all Manager management interfaces. Manager Operator indicates a Manager Operator. Users associated with this role have all permissions on the home page, cluster, host, and OM tab pages. Other pages cannot be accessed. By default, user groups preconfigured in the MRS cluster also contain some permissions. Users can quickly bind users when adding service users, meeting the permission combination requirements in different service scenarios. If the preconfigured roles or user groups cannot meet the requirements of user scenarios, administrators can create and customize roles based on service scenario requirements. Add roles on the Manager page to authorize and manage resource objects on different Manager pages or components in a cluster. For example, you can create a role that has the read permission on the specified HDFS directory. By default, the admin user of the MRS cluster has the highest operation rights on Manager, but does not have the management rights for components in the cluster. Generally, the administrator needs to plan and create different service users based on the actual service scenario requirements. When creating a user, you can bind the created role and user group to the user so that the user can obtain the resource permissions corresponding to the user group and role. Ranger is a centralized security management framework on the Hadoop platform. It can implement fine-grained data access control for HDFS, Hive, and HBase. In a cluster where the Ranger component is installed, you can configure policies on the Ranger Web UI to control users' access to these components. The permission model of the Ranger consists of multiple permission policies. Resources are objects provided by components that can be accessed by users. For example, HDFS files or folders, queues in Yarn, and databases, tables, and columns in Hive. A user is a visitor to the system. The permission of each user is obtained by the policy associated with the user. Users, user groups, and roles on manager of the MRS cluster are periodically synchronized to Ranger. In the Ranger permission policy, various access conditions can be configured for resources. For example, file read and write. Specifically, the permission conditions, rejection conditions, and exception conditions can be configured. When configuring resource permission policies in the Ranger, you can configure the permission conditions, exception conditions, rejection conditions, and rejection exception conditions for specified resources to meet requirements in different scenarios. The following figure shows the priorities of different conditions and the system judgment process when a user requests to access resources. When an external cluster resource access request is received, the system queries all policies matching the resource. A rejection condition has a higher priority than a permit condition, and an exception condition has a higher priority than a non-exception condition. If a component resource request does not match the permission policy in the Ranger, the system denies access by default. For HDFS and Yarn, the system assigns the decision to the access control layer of the component for further judgment. For example, if you want to grant the read and write permissions of an HDFS folder to user group A, except user B in the user group, you can add a permission condition and an exception condition. After the MRS cluster is created, the Ranger component is installed by default, and the components that support Ranger authentication are enabled by default. The Ranger administrator can set fine-grained access permission policies for component resources. You can also manually disable the Ranger authentication function for the corresponding component. If the Ranger authentication function is disabled for the component, you can control the permission on related resources based on the role management mechanism in Manager. That's all about user permission management in MRS clusters. For more details, please visit Huawei Cloud Help Center.